It's great to be with you. This is the most important talk I've done this week, and it is one of the last talks of my speaking tour, which has been going on since October, since I released my book, almost continuously. And I've been all around the country, almost everywhere. I've now been close to the Canadian border. And I've been close to the US-Mexico border, too. I've been everywhere. I always say I've been to every field house and hen house and outhouse and dog house and flop house in the country, but I haven't yet been to a whorehouse. But I'm willing to speak there if they invite me. But I'll be the one getting an honorarium or a fee, not them. And something's happening out there. Things have been changing since my book tour started. I've been witnessing. It is perceptible that things are changing. And so it's been incredible to come here and see the change on the ground in this place. And so first I want to extend my thanks to the people who brought me out here, namely Judith Kolikoff, who is a legend in activism, a legendary local activist. I mean, we're talking about generations of activism and work leading us to this point. We wouldn't be here without people like her. And McDonald Sullivan, who also has a very impressive legacy of activism and humanitarian activity that goes all the way back to his family, helping to give Jews sanctuary in Shanghai during World War II. And now McDonald has been traveling back and forth to Palestine to try to find some kind of sanctuary and protection for Palestinians. So McDonald just drove me from Ballard down to Tukwala. And it was in Tukwala where a group of undocumented migrants were protesting outside the Department of Homeland Security headquarters. And they've been holding protests in Tacoma as well, outside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement headquarters. And they have been protesting President Barack Obama's racist war on immigrants. We're talking about 400,000 deportations every year, over 2 million people deported. The people I met outside that center had been in there, had been jailed in Tacoma for 5 months. Jorge Moreno told me he was jailed simply for being charged with the DUI, and he was held for 5 months without legal representation, indefinitely, without even knowing when he would be released. He was warehoused, and he said he would meet people inside that center who would be deported for the same crime that he got, but from a different judge. And no one knows why these deportations are happening. They're arbitrary. He is from Matamoros, and he said if he told them that he was from Matamoros and was deported, they would send him to Tijuana so that he would be far from his family, or to Mexico City. These are called lateral deportations. He would be flown on a plane owned by the private prison contractor Geo, which Geo owns its own plane, and he would be shackled along with almost 100 other undocumented immigrants on the plane. They would be held in shackles. I met Lupe Noriega, whose husband is currently in the ICE detention center. He was picked up for a DUI even though he wasn't driving and the car wasn't moving. He was sitting in the driver's seat waiting for his wife to pick him up. He's a construction worker. They had just built a new home, and he volunteered on the weekends to build ramps for disabled people. And he has been in there for 3 months because even after being brought before a judge and being acquitted, ICE put a hold, an immigration hold on him, meaning he was indefinitely detained and has been charged with nothing. And there are hundreds of people in there like that. The conditions are so bad in this privatized prison, which you all are paying for, that people have begun hunger striking. These migrants are hunger striking, and they're being placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. The Geo security contractors have changed into SWAT uniforms and are threatening them with force feeding, bringing out tubes to threaten them with to reduce the number of hunger strikers. Now, hold on one second. Forgot my phone was back there. This is absurd. And how does it connect to what we're here to talk about? Well, it definitely connects, and we are here for these people. We're here for these victims of Obama's racist war on immigration, just as we're here for the victims of Israeli apartheid. And it connects clearly. What we're looking at is a kind of shadow of an America that I thought had passed, that many of us thought didn't exist. We were told we lived in a post-racial society. But what we see is that there are still two Americas. An America embraced by our 1%, where deportations are fine, where the people who were invited today to Barack Obama's Civil Rights Summit said nothing about these deportations because they wanted to be closer to power than to stand for principle. And on the other side was the other America, where people like those of you with super were outside Barack Obama's hollow Civil Rights Summit protesting the deportations, and they were arrested because they had the courage to stand up for principle over power. We have the America of the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson, the largest donor to American politics in history, who also happens to be Benjamin Netanyahu's chief political patron, and Paul Singer, who is another major supporter of Israel, who has just founded a major political action committee that will be pumping money into our 2014 and 2016 elections, impacting the kind of racist and Islamophobic discussion we hear around foreign policy. And on the other side, we have students like those who are working with Students for Justice in Palestine in Tucson, who strapped themselves, who chained themselves to buses owned by the GEO Corporation, which were taking undocumented migrants out of a federal courtroom where they were trialed en masse, shackled together to a private prison in Eloy, Arizona, controlled by CCA, and who have connected the cause of Palestine to the cause of undocumented immigrants in America and the cause of indigenous people everywhere. We have these two Americas, and the polarization is increasing. The differences are more clear than ever before. And what we notice is that those who embrace the old America, the America of the Confederacy, the America of voter disenfranchisement, who are advancing voter suppression in southern states to disenfranchise African Americans, who are re-inaugurating Jim Crow under a new Jim Crow, which has disenfranchised millions of African Americans, that they are uniting around a different cause. They are uniting around a foreign country. They are uniting around a country that embodies the kind of country that they would like America to be again. It is the state of Israel, a country with no borders, where everyone lives under a regime of separation and rights are apportioned according to ethnicity and the circumstances of their birth. And those who want to go back to those days of restrictive covenants, the University of Washington has a database of all the restrictive covenants that kept Seattle white up until 1968 and confined minorities, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and even those defined in restrictive covenants as Hebrews, Jews, to certain areas, especially in the center of Seattle. Those who want that America again are uniting around Israel, and you can just look at who is attempting to crush your efforts on campus. Look at who's funding the attacks on you. Look at who's funding the attacks on me, the Brandeis Center, run by Kenneth Marcus, who has attempted to water down Title VI protections in the 1964 Civil Rights Act for minorities on campus and defund Middle East Studies departments, has produced a 65-page booklet to illustrate my anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, this pamphlet, report, whatever you want to call it, screed, doesn't contradict a single fact in my book. If anything, it confirms them. And it's the ultimate in trolling, highlighting which tweets I've favorited, looking for anything to paint me as anti-Semitic. And what it comes down to is that I simply am in favor of Palestinian equal rights and oppose what is clearly a system of apartheid. Now, the Brandeis Center is funded not only by the typical pro-Israel groups, but by the Bradley Foundation, which is a key funder of the right wing, and it was the Bradley Foundation that funded the attack on affirmative action and introduced a resolution in California to end affirmative action, whitening the state schools of California. It was the Bradley Foundation that funded the research behind the book The Bell Curve, which claims, using junk pseudoscience, that whites and Asians are genetically superior to African Americans and Latinos, based also on research produced by the Pioneer Fund, a eugenics group. And so these groups are uniting to crush Palestine solidarity on campus. The American Society for Trustees and Associates and Alumni is partnering with the Bradley Foundation to crush Middle East studies and to crush ethnic studies on campus. And so once they do what they did at Northeastern University, where the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter has been suspended indefinitely for leafleting, simply for leafleting, something that students take for granted as something they can do on campus, and where 2 of those students who weren't even in the leadership of SJP are threatened with expulsion. Once they can replicate that success on campus after campus, there will be one less progressive ally when they come for the rest of us, when they come for ethnic studies. We know where it starts, but we don't know where it ends. And it's consistent with a push around the country that has put McCarthyism at the front of the pro-Israel playbook. But it's not going to work. I've seen its failure around this country as people are coming to this cause from unlikely backgrounds, from unlikely places, to agitate for a cause that is as basic as freedom itself, equal rights. And let's make it clear, let's not be gaslighted into believing that we're the extremists. Because if you oppose equality before the law, you are an enemy of democracy, period. And that's who's behind this suppression push on campus. Now, the main thing that they're attempting to do, and they've been doing this for decades, is to restrict the free flow of information around this issue, and especially around the reporting, journalism, and discussion of Israel-Palestine and what it really is. Now, I approached this as a journalist. After I finished my first book, I immediately went to Israel-Palestine to report for 4 or 5 years, 4 or 5 years of research, about a year on the ground, on what was happening since Israel elected in 2009 the most right-wing government in its history. And what I found was a place where the green line had basically evaporated. And you could see apartheid anywhere you went. You didn't have to go to the occupied territories. You didn't have to go to the Gaza Strip, which had just been decimated, pummeled over 3 weeks by Israeli airstrikes and an Israeli invasion that destroyed 80% of all arable land, that destroyed the only chicken farm in the Gaza Strip, the Sawari chicken farms. I quote a tank gunner in my book saying, "We were ordered to fire at chickens. It was the most absurd thing I'd ever done. You know, if only we knew what was in those chickens, those terrorist chickens." They destroyed the only flour mill on the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip has been under siege since 2006. The Israeli human rights group Gisha subpoenaed documents from the Israeli Defense Ministry showing that Israeli administrators literally counted the calories each resident of the Gaza Strip was able to receive. That means that they used complex mathematical formulas to determine how much people in the Gaza Strip can eat. That shows the level of control that Israel has over the residents of the Gaza Strip. 1.8 million people in what can only be described as an open-air prison. And we're going to come back to that. But I mentioned restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants which restricted people from moving into certain neighborhoods in Seattle. And we consider that to be anachronistic. It's something that we think we've left behind. We reject it. We would all go out and protest against it. The pro-Israel students here would join you in those protests, I bet. Those restrictive covenants were officially outlawed by a court order in Seattle in 1948, which is a seminal year. although they remained kind of enforced off the books until 1968, thanks to a federal ruling. In 1948, Israel was born, and it brought into history a system that was being outlawed in the United States and which was being extinguished as the colonial era drew to a close. Israel was born out of classic settler colonialism. Theodore Herzl, in a letter to Cecil Rhodes, pleaded for his support and said, our system of Zionism, our project of Zionism is very colonial. Those were his words. The founders of Israel set out to build a Jewish state in historic Palestine, in a predominantly Arab area that was predominantly Muslim and Christian. How is it possible to achieve such a country and build a democracy? Well, if you don't have a majority of Jews and you want it to be democratic, you have to change the demographics somehow. And that's not an easy thing to do. So between 1947 and 1948, Zionist militias, which then became the Israeli army, expelled over 750,000 indigenous Palestinians, altering the demographics. Israel became the only settler colonial state in the 20th century to obtain a demographic majority of its own population within the territory it controlled and to gain recognition at the UN. And it gained recognition at the UN through subterfuge, by basically lying and being deceptive. It promised that it would enforce Resolution 194 at the Lausanne Conference in 1949, because in 1948, Israel was rejected by the General Assembly of the UN for admission because it refused to allow those refugees back. Why wouldn't it allow those refugees to come back? Because they're not Jewish. If they come back and you give them the right to vote, full citizenship rights, you're not a Jewish and democratic state. Now, in 1948, there was a village near Haifa called Ein Hod, whose residents were driven out, but did something different than many others did. Because there was a campaign of organized psychological terror to ensure that people were driven into what was then Jordanian-controlled territory. But the Al-Hijah family huddled in a wadi and basically hid out near their village. And they stayed, and they managed to reestablish themselves in the area, even though they could never gain recognition from the new state of Israel. I arrived in Ein Hod, and you can read about this in my book. I don't know if it'll ever show up here. I arrived there in 2010. It was one of the first places I wanted to go in Israel, and it's a beautiful place. It almost looks like you're out in Bellingham, which is unusual for a Mediterranean, Middle Eastern environment. There is a pine forest there that Israelis refer to as Little Switzerland, with the same kind of foliage you see out here, very unusual. Well, it turns out that those pine trees were not natural to the environment, or were about as natural as the hair plugs are to Joe Biden's head. They were planted there by the Jewish National Fund, which is a 501c3 nonprofit which raises tens of millions of dollars inside the United States, and has had speakers like President Bill Clinton garnering $100,000 speaking fees. Stephen Harper has spoken at a gala for the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund, since 1907, since it was founded by Herzl, has been involved in displacing the indigenous population and ethnic cleansing. Its directors were on the transfer committee that decided which Palestinian villages should be destroyed and who should be expelled at the end of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe in 1948. And they built this forest, now known as Little Switzerland, the Carmel Forest, over the ruins of several Palestinian towns which were destroyed in 1948 to ensure that their residents could not come back and rebuild. It was very strategic. But Ein Hod still stood. It was saved by a Romanian Dadaist painter named Marcel Janco in 1950. It was saved from the dynamite and the bulldozers. And Janco transformed it into an artist colony. So when I arrived, I went into these art studios, which were these beautiful stone homes, and I saw the Judaica kitsch that was for sale, and I followed a tour guide who was leading Israeli tourists on a tour, and who said that these were third-generation homes. I started asking a lot of questions, and it didn't seem like I was welcome in that village. I had my camera out, and I was filming those stone homes, and I filmed the local brewery, which looked cool. You know, you like to go to breweries here in Seattle. You have like, what do you call them, nano breweries? You can do a nano pub crawl. We don't have that where I live. It's better out here. And I filmed inside the restaurant called Bonanza, which is an airy restaurant in a big stone structure that had a wood-burning oven cooking pizza and a bar. And I left that village looking for clues into what had happened before. I mean, looking for someone to tell me an honest account of the history of it. I had to go 3 kilometers up the road to another village called Ein Hod. And this was where the Al-Hijab family had gone. That village had been until 2006 an unrecognized village, meaning the state of Israel refused to supply it with electricity, refused to provide it with sewage, water, sanitation, public schools, public health clinics, nothing, even though they were forced to pay taxes just to be there. In 2006, out of embarrassment, the state finally granted them recognition, and they're there. And they took me in and explained that those stone homes used to be their homes. They are not allowed to return to those homes because they're not Jewish. That Bonanza restaurant, where there were pizzas being cooked, it looked so nice and beautiful, they cannot go back there, even though that was their mosque, where they would like to go back and worship. It is now a bar. And so the situation became pretty clear as night fell and Moin Al-Hijab pulled out a map, as so many Palestinians had in so many meetings I've had with them, of destroyed villages along the north coast of Israel, and showed me where he had lived, where his relatives had lived, and what lay beneath those pine trees, those pine needles in a mountain of lies. And it was a Nakba. And I said, is it possible for Arabs to move into Ein Hod, the Jewish Ein Hod? Why not? How do they keep you out? Well, there was a law called the Absentee Property Law, one of the first discriminatory and racist laws passed by the State of Israel, which handed all of the property previously owned by the refugees who were expelled between 1947 and 1948 into the hands of the new State of Israel to give to exclusively Jewish new citizens. The Jewish National Fund has a mission of buying land or controlling land and providing it to the Jewish people, meaning it's land for Jews only. It's as good as a restrictive covenant. And even though the Jewish National Fund only controls 20% of the land in what is known as Israel proper, it has 7 out of the 13 seats on the Israel Lands Authority, which controls the rest of the land, meaning that it can ensure that that land is only handed to Jews. But even if you look at the micro level, Ein Hod has an acceptance committee which functions like a restrictive covenant, and they vet candidates to live in that town for social suitability. And they have not let anyone who isn't Jewish move into the town. It's the same in the Misgav Regional Council, which controls 26 towns in the north of Israel. They have acceptance committees which are now requiring new applicants to take loyalty oaths or oaths to uphold Zionism. And it's the same in kibbutzim I visited, which I describe in my book, close to the Gaza border, where they have said that their community is Zionist and secular. And I said, well, how can an Arab live in your community? And they said, well, we don't turn them away, they'll turn themselves away. This was the director of security in a kibbutz I went to. And so the idea of restrictive covenants, of a racially exclusive or ethnically exclusive or religiously exclusive society, go to the heart of what a Jewish state in historic Palestine is about. That is the essence of that state, and that is how they maintain a Jewish majority. And sometimes it can look beautiful on the surface. If you look at Ein Hod, it looks like you're in Europe. Sometimes it's not so beautiful. If you look at the separation wall, 638 kilometers of concrete and monitoring systems provided by Elbit, the Israeli state-run weapons firm, which just got a $145 million contract from the Department of Homeland Security to put those same monitoring systems on the US-Mexico border, including inside Nogales. Though that wall was put there, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, to prevent demographic spillover, to separate people on ethnic and religious lines. And it's the same if you look at the Gaza Strip, whose residents are 80% refugees, meaning they have legitimate claims to land and property inside Israel according to UN Resolution 194, but who must be warehoused indefinitely as human surplus in this besieged coastal territory simply because they're not Jewish, because they do not fit the character that the state of Israel is based on, the ethnic character that the state is based on. If they were Jewish, the walls would come down tomorrow. They'd be allowed to fish more than 3 kilometers out at sea. They would not be under siege. They wouldn't be fired at for entering the 300-meter buffer zone near the borders of Israel. It would be over. Halas. But they were born into the wrong circumstances. As for me, an American Jew who doesn't even have Israeli citizenship, I have more rights than any Palestinian in the world between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, simply because of who I was born to. And I have about as much connection to that land as the San Francisco-based Creedence Clearwater Revival does to the Bayou. My great-grandmother, Manya Finkelstein, came over on a boat from the Ukraine, from the Kiev, where my family was completely dispossessed, to the United States. And my grandparents settled in the west side of Chicago. My parents met in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So when I go back to Cambridge, that's my real birthright tour. I don't understand this idea that I have a birthright in Israel, but the state of Israel is based on a secular messianic philosophy that brings me in direct connection with the dehydrated, nomadic, early Bronze Age people who wandered around this land, and says that I have a direct connection to them, that I was somehow, my relatives were kicking it on the corner with Methuselah and, smoking weed off the tomb of Solomon and chilling with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's the logic of my connection to the land of Israel. It's why I, unlike any of you who are non-Jewish, and especially unlike those of you who are Palestinian, who have Huiyah, whose families are there, or who are diaspora Palestinians, why I can get citizenship tomorrow and immediate benefits from the Jewish agency, and I can move to a settlement in the West Bank. I can move wherever I want. It's why I can move freely even as a non-Israeli, while my Palestinian American friends in Ramallah have to beg me to sneak them through the Kalandia checkpoint and through that wall just so they can go to the beach. So as I said, anywhere you look, there's apartheid. You don't even need to look beyond Ben Gurion International Airport. My experience going to that airport is a good one. I haven't gone since I've released a book, so that might change. But everyone who goes to that airport is assigned by Israeli security a number, 1 through 6, based on your perceived danger, and your danger is connected to your ethnicity. So many Arab Americans get deported, over 100 a year, as documented by the journalists Ali Gharib and George Hale. People get deported like Noor Judah, who is a Palestinian-American teacher at the Quaker school in the West Bank, who was attempting to reunite with her students after a short trip to Amman, Jordan, so she could finish out the semester. She was deported for 10 years, and those kids never got to finish the semester. People like the dangerous Jewish octogenarian Noam Chomsky have been deported by the state of Israel at the border because of their political views. Norman Finkelstein faced the same fate. My friend Jared Melson, a Jewish-American kid who's really a straightforward reporter, who is working for Ma'an News, a Palestinian news service, was held in a cell for 8 days before he was deported for 10 years because of the kind of reporting he was doing. I have been treated in such a favorable way because of who I am. I'm asked, am I Jewish? Yes. Are my parents Jewish? Yes. Are my grandparents Jewish? Yes. How many times are you going to ask me how many members of my family are Jewish before you let me in? Well, not too many. Go. And I get a 1 or a 2. On one occasion, when I was getting asked too many questions, I said I was going to meet my girlfriend in Tel Aviv, who didn't exist. I was asked, are you planning on having children? And I said, yes, of course. Raising the specter of a Jewish Israeli woman being injected with top-grade Ashkenazi sperm and producing Jewish babies to offset the Arab demographic threat. And I was greeted with a huge smile. And I was waved through an additional security check. While others had to have their bags hand-checked, I was waved through and welcomed. Welcome home to Zion. Okay, now where the hell am I? Well, actually, I am not in Tel Aviv. I'm in Lod, which used to be known as Lydda, which used to be known as the Lydda airfield, and was captured by Zionist forces after tens of thousands of Palestinians were driven out of Lydda at gunpoint, after a series of massacres that are known as the Lydda Death March. That is where Ben Gurion International is constructed, on the site of Palestinian destruction. So, as I entered Israel, I found everywhere I went that this kind of treatment was consistent. And what I saw was that for Jews like me, I was very lucky. I could go and ignore apartheid if I wanted to. I could have a really good time. When I went on the Birthright Israel trip, this free trip for young American Jews, I was able to kind of tune out some of the uglier sides of Israel. And it's amazing that so many Americans go on these tours and don't see what many of us have seen or what many of you have experienced. But this time was different because I settled in Jaffa on Dr. Ehrlich Street, 5 minutes south of Tel Aviv. And I was in the ghetto, the Palestinian ghetto of Tel Aviv, which used to be known as the Bride of the Sea. It was one of the most thriving cultural and economic cities in the Arab world before 1947 and 1948, when tens of thousands of its residents were literally driven into the sea under artillery fire. The community is sort of reconstituted, but they live under a discriminatory regime, and they are under the control of the Tel Aviv municipality, which means they are under the control of an all-Jewish municipality. And that's the point. They have very little, if no, sovereignty. On Dr. Ehrlich Street, I lived across from the Jacob Zahalon Geriatric Center. This used to be known as the Jamal Dashani Hospital. And Jamal Dajani, the street was named after Jamal Dajani. Jamal Dajani was Fuad Dajani. And the Dajani family were one of the original Palestinian aristocratic families. The street was renamed and Hebraicized, and the hospital was seized by the State of Israel in 1948 and named after a 17th century Italian physician who is as familiar to Jaffa as an ice skating rink. And the street was renamed after Dr. Paul Ehrlich, a 19th century Austrian Jewish physician. And this has happened all over the state of Israel. A new state rose up on the ruins of another after a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. But as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. In my neighborhood, there were 500 standing eviction orders, all applying to Palestinians, simply because in 1948, their homes, 40% of their homes were placed into the hands of the state holding company, and they are unable to get permits to renovate their homes. So if they dare build an extra bedroom or renovate their kitchen, they get an eviction order. There is a very clear intent here to move them out. Gentrification is taking place in a more aggressive way than we can even imagine in Seattle. The new gated community built in the center of Jaffa, Andromeda Hills, has begun filing noise complaints to silence the call of the muezzin from the two mosques, whose foundation predates the State of Israel, and the local church, to silence the tolling of its bells, to do what the Israeli government calls Judaization. And this is happening in cities all around Israel proper. I noticed the presence of right-wing hooligans from the West Bank in this community who had consolidated their hold on what they view as Judea and Samaria, but what we understand to be the occupied West Bank, and were moving into core Israeli cities to create more pressure on the indigenous population that was left. Firebombing my favorite fish restaurant, which was owned by Palestinian Christians, and where I would like to host my friends from Tel Aviv. Vandalizing the local Muslim cemetery, which stood directly next to the Perez Center for Peace. Holding Jaffa for Jews marches, as you viewed in that film. And this week, on the anniversary of the Deir Yassin massacre, a massacre of Palestinians in a village near Jerusalem, which is viewable from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum. The gravestones of the victims of that massacre, of the more than 200 women and children killed there, were vandalized, and "Death to Arabs" was spray painted on their gravestones. This is happening all around Israel in a campaign to finish 48. Finish 48 is the mantra of those who lead Israel right now. It is the mantra of the right wing, and it is why the right wing dominates Israeli politics. Because in this crisis, Israel still faces resistance from the indigenous population. Unlike the United States, they are unable to make mascots out of their indigenous population. They are still resisting in one way or another. They can't name their military hardware after Arabs. They can't name their teams after Arabs, as we have done with Native Americans, because their process of settler colonialism is ongoing. And so they have yet to consolidate the ethnocratic character of the state that they want to create. It's why they're always demanding that the Palestinians recognize a Jewish state, because they feel like the project is unfinished. The project that began in 1948 and continued seamlessly through 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is an unfinished one. The young Israelis who are growing up, Jewish Israelis, and see no way out of this, are more right-wing than their parents and their parents' generation. And the government of Benjamin Netanyahu has openly declared, through various ministers, from the foreign minister Avigdor Lieberman, who is possibly the next prime minister, and defense minister Moshe Ya'alon, that there isn't an end game, and that their strategy is to maintain the situation, is to maintain the crisis. So that means that beneath the cover of the US-encouraged status quo, and beneath the cover of a media blackout, which I've been trying to puncture and perforate and break through, ethnic cleansing is occurring day after day after day, and the call to finish 48, the mantra of finish 48, is the right wing's ticket to a permanent majority in Israeli society and the closure of any democratic space, closing off space for Jewish Israeli dissidents who are leveling their bodies against the occupation and who are now facing a constant wave of shin bet interrogations, of monitoring and demonization. They are demonized as Smolenim. It is one of the worst insults in Israel right now, and it simply means leftist. According to the Israeli Democracy Institute, in poll year after year after year, majority of Jewish Israeli youth, well over 50%, declare their refusal to sit in a classroom with an Arab citizen of Israel. And they have declared that they would refuse to live next door to an Arab or to a migrant worker. They, a plurality of Israelis in 2011 in the Israeli Democracy Institute poll, have declared that they favor detention camps for Arabs during wartime. And when is wartime in Israel? Well, Israel's been in a perpetual state of emergency since 1948 and reauthorizes it frequently. In one of the most recent reauthorizations, Supreme Court Justice Eliakim Rubinstein declared that it must be reauthorized because Israel is a normal country that is not normal. In other words, we'd like to see ourselves as normal, but we will never be normal, so we need to implement these measures to either maintain the situation, as we embark on the project of finishing 48. And so we see the call to finish 48, and we hear it in the words of Deputy Transportation Minister Tzipi Hotovely, the Sarah Palin of Israel, who speaks better English than Sarah Palin, who is 34 and telegenic and represents the new face of the governing Likud party, who favors annexing the West Bank, who has told Hanin Zawabi, the most hated woman in Israel, a Palestinian Christian legislator who traveled on the Free Gaza flotilla, and who is hated because she campaigns for Israel as a state of all its citizens with no racial or religious preferences, who has told Zawabi and promised her that she would ban her and remove all Arabs from the Knesset. And that project is on its way. We hear the call to finish 48 in the recent vote to raise the electoral threshold to 4 seats because the Arab parties in the Knesset hold less than 4 seats, making it impossible for them to campaign as anything but a larger bloc. We hear the call to finish 48 in Hoteveli, declaring, "I am a Jewish racist. I favor a Jewish state with a Jewish majority." And that pretty much distills the mentality of those of her generation and explain why she is on a stepping stone for higher office. We hear the call to finish 48 in the tracts of state-funded rabbis, key religious authorities who decide who can become citizen, who is a Jew, who can get married, and who have declared that it is illegal, who have falsely declared, falsely misinterpreting the Torah, declaring that it is illegal under Jewish law to rent apartments to non-Jews, meaning Arabs and African refugees. You saw a copy of that letter in the video, and whose wives issued a dual letter declaring that it is illegal under Jewish law for Jews to have relationships with non-Jews, addressing their letter at Orthodox women who are dating Arabs, who are non-Jewish. We hear the call to finish 48 in the anti-miscegenation movement, which they've inspired, which is crusading in core Israeli cities to prevent interracial and interreligious relationships, which operates a hotline allowing callers to inform on interreligious dating, on couples who are dating interreligiously, who operate a coast guard and patrols, warning Jewish women not to speak to Arab men, warning Arab men of harsh consequences if they speak to Jewish women, placing posters all around Jerusalem, which I have seen, containing photographs of Arab men who are accused of making passes at Jewish women or dating them, and who have testified before the Knesset on the dangers of assimilation at the invitation of Tzipi Hoteveli, the Deputy Transportation Minister. We hear the call to finish 48 in the decision by the National Civil Service Administration to bar religious Jewish women from volunteering in Israeli hospitals after 9 p.m. for fear that they will date Arab doctors. A bizarre and peculiar decision for me as an American Jew who's been raised to believe that it is good to have relationships with doctors. And that decision was endorsed by Economics Minister Naftali Bennett, another rising star who controls the 3rd largest party in Israel, Bayit Yehudi, or Jewish Home, which has introduced a plan to do away with the idea of Palestine altogether, to annex 60% of the West Bank and give Jordanian residency to those living in the 4 main Palestinian population centers. And we hear the call to finish 48 in the cries and bellows of the Jewish teenagers who beat Jamal Julani, the 19-year-old Palestinian, into a coma in Zion Square while dozens of people watched in the heart of Jerusalem, where I lived for 3 months and where I produced several videos attempting to warn of the tide of racism that was consuming this society, particularly in this place, and who had one of my most widely trafficked videos banned from YouTube and Vimeo and the Huffington Post, Feeling the Hate in Jerusalem. This warning was ignored, and Julani was set on by these teens after a 15-year-old female friend of theirs accused him of making a pass on her, later admitting it was a lie. And they chanted, "A Jew is a soul, an Arab is a son of a bitch," which it happens to also be the chant of the ultras, the fans of Beitar Jerusalem, who, after each goal at Teddy Stadium in Jerusalem, also chant "Death to Arabs" and wave banners bearing the image of Meir Kahane, the racist Israeli rabbi who argued for an ethnically pure state from the river to the sea and the full transfer of all Palestinians and Arabs who refused to take loyalty oaths. The loyalty oath that was introduced by Meir Kahane in 1987 and led to his banning by the Knesset by the Israeli Knesset for racist incitement. That loyalty oath has been passed with the endorsement of the former head of the Labor Party, Ehud Barak, the left-of-center Labor Party, and now requires all who seek to become new citizens of the State of Israel to take an oath of loyalty to the Jewish and democratic state. Haaretz, in an article about the new loyalty oath, declared that this is the ultimate victory of Kahana, and he did so with the help of the Labor Party. Of course, the Labor Party, Kahana, Likud, any party within the Zionist spectrum wants the same thing that Tzipi Hotovely said the self-identified Jewish racist said she wanted, a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. Without that, you can't have a Jewish state. They are all united in the cause of producing an ethnically pure state free of demographic contaminants. And so the Nakba that occurred in 1947 and 1948 continues every day. Every day for Palestinians brings a continuation of the Nakba. In the Negev desert, the Nakba continues most nakedly. And this is inside Israel, home to 80,000 Bedouins who are not nomadic people. They actually live in villages. They actually often have titles to their land. They don't ride around on donkeys. But they live in unrecognized villages. Their villages can't be recognized, and they can't receive public services, even though they're citizens of the State of Israel, even though they pay taxes, even though they often even serve in the Israeli army and die in the Israeli army fighting Palestinians. Why? Because unlike me, they're not Jewish. If I went and got a minyan together here of my Jewish friends, and we tried to set up a community in the Negev desert, we would not only get immediate benefits from the Jewish Agency, which is calling for Judaization of the Negev and Galilee, heavily Arab areas inside Israel, we would get state recognition, and we would get hooked up to the state electricity supply, sewage, etc. Not only that, thanks to a recent law called the Acceptance to Communities Act, we would be able to turn anyone away based on their religion or ethnicity. This law authorizes communities of under 500 to do just that, to have restrictive covenants on the books officially. And so as this system recedes in the United States, it takes Israel over like a tidal wave. The Israeli government introduced a plan called the Prawer Plan, it's spelled Prawer, to expel 40 to 70,000 Bedouins from their unrecognized villages, claiming that they were living there illegally and that their construction was illegal. It would have authorized either the destruction of their towns or their relocation to some unspecified place. And it was clear where they were going to send them. In the whole history of the State of Israel, there are only 5 towns that the state has allowed to be built for Arabs. They're towns like Rahat and Hura, which are basically Indian reservations, built according to the website of the Or movement, which administers these towns and is a subsidiary of the Jewish National Fund to concentrate the Bedouin population. And so this dark language of concentration, which bears horrible resonances in Jewish history, but also in the history of Japanese Americans who were concentrated in Manzanar during World War II because they were deemed to possess enemy race blood, has been reintroduced in the modern state of Israel in the 21st century, and under the same very logic that those Bedouins have been identified by Benjamin Netanyahu and by the chief demographer of the state of Israel, Arnon Sofer, who they call Arnon the Arab counter because Sofer in Hebrew means counter, has been identified as a demographic threat because they're having too many children. We have to recognize that those children are the greatest threat to a Jewish state simply by being born. Their crime is being born, and they bear a greater threat to the Jewish state than any rocket from Hamas and any rocket from Hezbollah, because they threaten to destroy the Jewish state by existing. That's the logic of the state. And whenever anyone tells you that with your call for Palestinian equality amounts to the destruction of the Jewish state, you have to ask them, so what does that say about the Jewish state, that equality equals destruction? That's the question that so few are willing to answer. So that Prawer Plan has been stopped in the Knesset by 2 votes and has been reintroduced. It appeared in the open in Israel. It was reported and widely debated in Israel. And there was widespread public support for some version of it. But in this country, it wasn't debated. I'm sure many of you have heard about it because there's been a lot of activism around it. But before that activism, it wasn't discussed and it wasn't debated, even though it was well known for 2 years inside Israel. What does that say about our media? It's shocking. This was an open plan for expulsion. And when the New York Times and Jodi Rudoren, the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times, finally reported on this plan, she called it a resettlement program, as if they're helping the Bedouin, which is straightforward colonial logic. Now, finally, we saw a documentary about another demographic threat to Israel, the 60,000 non-Jewish refugees who have come from Sudan, from the Darfur region, and from Eritrea, fleeing repression, fleeing genocide at the hands of the Janjaweed, often fleeing to Israel, not for economic reasons, but because they believed that Israel had signed the UN Convention on Refugee Rights and embodied the lessons of the Holocaust and would protect them. And what they found was that they faced a new war on their existence, as they were deprived of work permits and concentrated in South Tel Aviv, in a neighborhood under the control of a right wing, and pitted against another marginalized population, the Mizrahim, or Arab Jews, who have faced discrimination at the hands of the state, but still receive benefits. And so you see a situation play out in South Tel Aviv that resembles the situation in the American Deep South, where poor whites were pitted against poor blacks by oligarchs to break down the class interests they shared and to prevent their solidarity and to preserve this system of dominance and inequality. And it is what led to those race riots you saw in that video. On May 23rd, 2012, Miri Regev, who has since been promoted to Interior Committee chairperson in the Knesset, stood before 1,000 angry residents of the Hatikva quarter in Tel Aviv, that poor South Tel Aviv neighborhood, and declared that Africans are a cancer in Israel's body. According to the Israeli Democracy Institute, 52% of Jewish Israelis agreed with that opinion, and a plurality agreed with acts of violence against Africans to drive them out. Eli Yishai, who declared that the Interior Committee chairperson, the head of the Israeli Interior Committee and the chairman of the supremacist Shas party, who appeared at the beginning of that documentary, promised to make the lives of Africans miserable. And he said that they are Muslims who don't recognize that this country belongs to the white man. Interesting, because Yishai, as you saw, has olive skin, is not white. His family comes from Tunisia. But in Israel, race is constructed and identity is constructed on a different basis. And as a Jew, he sees himself as a member of the white man, as a white man. And so, on May 23rd, 2012, after Miri Regev's proclamation, hundreds of vandals set out into the neighborhoods where Africans were attempting to maintain businesses and homes, and attacked them, attacked any African they could find, and were held back from a full-scale riot and bloodshed by the last-minute presence of border police. This was taken as a sign by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government to act. And so they amended, I'm being told to wrap it up, and I'm wrapping it up here. So they amended, and this is a fascinating connection. They amended a 1953 law called the Prevention of Infiltration Act, which was originally intended to illegalize the presence of Palestinians driven out between 1947 and 1948 to apply to Africans. And so under this law, any African who is non-Jewish, who had committed the crime of not being a Jew inside Israeli territory, could be picked up, arrested, and detained indefinitely without being charged with anything. Much like those migrants who I met today, who have been deprived of legal counsel and not charged and held indefinitely. And 500 of them are now in the Holot internment center in the Negev desert, which also relies on private prison contractors, in Israel. One of the companies that provides much of the prisons that hold Palestinians and will hold African migrants is one of them that provides them with surveillance equipment and the means to control this population is G4S. And G4S is increasingly getting contracts in the US and is at the top of the boycott list of the BDS movement. So Holot is has an interesting set of rules, which are different from our ICE centers because they're simply prisons. Israel doesn't consider Holot to be a prison. They call it an open accommodation center. And anyone held there is allowed to technically leave, except there's nowhere to go because they're in the Negev desert. And they have to check in 3 times a day for roll call. The only rule that confines them is that they must be there after sundown for fear that they will integrate into the Israeli public, for fear that they will assimilate. And so it reminded me, this rule, of rules that I had spoken about before, restrictive covenants, but there were other rules. James Loewen, the American historian, wrote about these towns that dotted the American landscape in the 20s and 30s called sundown towns that had enacted ordinances limiting and illegalizing the presence of African Americans after sundown. So with this new legislation, the Prevention of Infiltration Act, the move to fully deport Africans in contravention of the UN Refugee Rights Convention, and the Holot Internment Center, Israel has established the largest sundown town in the world. And based on an open logic of ethnocracy, which is anachronistic and which we thought we had abandoned here, but which we are still fighting in this country to prevent from re-entering our politics and our policies. It's why people are protesting in Tacoma. It's why people organized in Olympia to honor the legacy of Rachel Corrie and to honor the hard work of Craig and Cindy Corrie, who've been fighting for 10 years for divestment from Caterpillar, whose D9 bulldozers have contributed to the destruction of over 26,000 Palestinian homes since 1967, according to the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolition. It's why the people in Olympia fought the Israeli government working through Stand With Us, the far-right Islamophobic extremist organization, to end their SLAP suit, their strategic lawsuit against public participation, and took it all the way to court and finally triumphed and can now divest from Israeli goods and speak out and state their opposition to this occupation and this apartheid and get in the way. It's why I'm seeing at campus after campus after campus divestment resolutions with students coming together, Jewish, Arab, African American, Latino, across the board. Massive solidarity and massive unity to introduce divestment resolutions from corporations that are involved in occupation. I started this leg of my book tour abruptly at the last second when the University of Michigan Students for Justice in Palestine flew me out at the last second to speak at the debate over their divestment resolution. 600 people were in the room. 500 more were waiting outside. 500 more students were waiting outside. This issue is overtaking campuses. It's becoming one of the key issues on campus, and it is ending the reprieve that the military-industrial complex, which has so many millions of dollars of contracts in research and development at American universities, it's ending the reprieve that they got after 9/11. It is doing what the anti-war movement has failed to do since the election of Barack Obama. With this movement we see growing on this country, which starts with Palestine, but draws so many intersections to the treatment of indigenous people, to the treatment of African Americans in the inner city who are facing policies of stop and frisk and felony disenfranchisement, to the treatment of prisoners, all these issues that have been left out and are ignored in Washington, which are expanding the horizons of the debate. With this movement, we are seeing a recognition that the facts that I described in my book, which are horrible, and which are dispossessing Palestinians and destroying their lives, but also corroding the fabric of Jewish-Israeli society and corroding Jewish life everywhere, sending it on a moral freefall, that won't change until this country changes first. until the war between the two Americas is resolved. And that's what Students for Justice in Palestine is doing, and that's why it's contingent on you to get in the way before 1948 is finished. And you get in the way here, just as Rachel Corrie got in the way in Gaza. And you get in the way here by divesting. And it will happen here. I hope it will happen here. And I hope you'll succeed. But by simply introducing the resolution, and by bringing this debate to your campus, and by bringing activism around this issue, you've already triumphed. Thank you. There is legal distinctions because of the historical annexation of the Southwest, but I think that there is no moral distinction. In the case of Palestinians, there is a treaty enabling them. We're going to call on you before. I remember your last question was, why am I a liar, at the last event. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say. No, you. But no, I do think that there should be that our border between the U.S. and Mexico should be virtually evaporated, and people should be vetted only for security reasons and not based on nationality.
You want to get rid of the Mexico-U.S. border?
I would like ultimately to do that. I think Mexicans are indigenous to the Southwest, to the southwestern United States. Now, to your questions, and they were basically kind of like talking points that I hear often, and it's disturbing to me that you're a PhD student and you stated things that are clearly completely false. First of all, that the 48 war was started by the Arab Higher Committee is clearly false. By the time that Israel was founded on May 15th, 1948, almost 200 Palestinian villages had already been destroyed. And up until that point, the Zionist Haganah and Stern Gang had only faced opposition from the Arab Liberation Army, which was poorly armed and could only put about 8,000 regular soldiers into the field against one of the most advanced armies in that region. The only opposition Israel faced was after May 15th, 1948, from the Jordanian Royal Army, which had been trained by Pasha John Gloob. And they only faced opposition at Latrun, which Israel came back and ethnically cleansed in 1967 to finish the job. It's the site of Canada Park, which has been built on the ruins of Yalu, Beit Nuba, and Imwas, which is known as Emmaus in the New Testament. And they fought over that territory, and then Gloob wanted to continue in to prevent the refugees from being driven out, but he was given orders by Abdullah not to do so because Abdullah was negotiating behind closed doors with Ben Gurion, with Golda Meir serving as the emissary, to deny the Palestinians a state. It's why he was assassinated 2 years later. So the war was started because of the UN partition plan, which the Zionist movement accepted under Ben Gurion's orders as a bluff, as he later admitted to Tawfiq Tubi. He admitted it to Tawfiq Tubi that he accepted it as a bluff. The conversation between the two is reproduced online, and any PhD student should know this. They had the conversation in 1957, and he said he did it because he knew the Arab Higher Committee couldn't accept such a bad deal, so it was better to paint them as rejectionists than to actually reject a deal that would have, if he... Well, let me teach you some history, all right? A good teacher has to learn from his students. All right? You can check me out. You can check out this history, but, I've spent some years studying, too.
Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, all their armies attacked Israel. Don't tell me that the Haganah have the biggest...
It's called the Haganah.
Come on, man.
Well, they don't want to learn. They don't want to learn.
All right, I'll sit here and learn. Keep teaching.
No. I think I'd... Okay, that's good.
I can't.
Okay, next two questions.
This is misbehavior. I'm gonna take 15 minutes off your recess, though. Okay? We should get to the other questions, but let me finish my point, which was that the partition plan gave what would become the state of Israel only a 10% demographic advantage over Arabs. It was 55% Jew, 45% Arab. That means it would have been impossible to have a Jewish and democratic state. If 10% of the Jewish population didn't show up to vote, then they could have had an Arab prime minister, which means that you needed to commit acts of massive ethnic cleansing to change the demographic reality, and that started well before May 15th, 1948, which is when those armies you named entered what is now Israel. 1967 started with an Israeli attack on the Egyptian Air Force. That's why they were able to win this lightning victory, because they attacked first and wiped out the Egyptian Air Force. And then they refused to negotiate when Nahum Goldman in 1971 had secured a commitment from Gamal Abdel Nasser to negotiate with Israel a normalization deal, which eventually happened at Camp David. They refused to negotiate because, according to Moshe Dayan, and this has been the mentality of Israel since the beginning, that he would rather have Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai without peace than peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. And so that led directly to the 1973 war, to the death of thousands of Israeli soldiers, to a catastrophe for Israel that 4 years later led them to Camp David, and has persisted this crisis for Egypt and Israel. And so I think you should just read basic history first. And I don't know what your PhD is in, but these are all pretty well established facts. Now let's get some more questions.
I studied Sino-Russian relations, sir.
All right, well, we ain't talking about China or Russia here. Let's get to, well, because you got a question of me in the last one, so we'll save the best for last. But let's get these two here, and then we have two here, and then we'll get back there. All right, you guys. I get those two questions everywhere I go. The first question is, how did I get interested in this issue? And I think all of you who are Jewish in this room understand that in Jewish American life, Zionism will kind of call on you in one way or another. I can just speak to my own experience growing up in Washington, D.C., and going to Hebrew school, that there was an American flag on the one side of the bima, the podium that the rabbi spoke from, and another on the other side was the Israeli flag, and next to it was a UN flag draped in a black flag, in a black drape. And I always thought, the UN's supposed to be good, they're going to save humanity or whatever. What's wrong with it? And they put the black drape over that flag in protest of the resolution at the UN in the 1970s declaring that Zionism is a form of racism. So I was in 5th grade, and so I'm like, what the hell is Zionism? Why is this debate going on? Then the first Intifada was happening, so it was being debated in front of me, and I was kind of curious about it. But I saw that there was a lot of rancor around the issue, and that critics and people who introduced different ideas were quickly shouted down, even at this young age, so it turned me off. But by the time the second Intifada was brewing, after the Oslo Accords, I went on the Birthright Israel program, which is a free trip for American Jews age 18 to 25. And, they claim, I can talk about the trip all night, but that's not the point. And obviously, if I'd known what I know now, I wouldn't have gone on that trip, but there was no way for me to know. They claim that trip will connect you with Israel for a lifetime. It will produce a lifelong connection between you and Israel. And they were right. It just didn't have the effect that they wanted it to have on me, because the second Intifada started after that, and I was disgusted by the suicide bombings, but I wanted to know why they were happening, what was going on the other side in the occupied territories. This narrative had been forbidden from me, not by my family. It wasn't really discussed at home, but it wasn't present in our media. It was hard to get to, and I knew somehow that I was being lied to. So I started questioning, and once you start questioning, the whole thing falls apart in your hands, sooner or later. It doesn't fall apart overnight. It's a process of several years. I watched the second invasion of Lebanon, in which Israel left 4 million cluster munitions behind in southern Lebanon after flattening South Beirut. And you can read the Amnesty International report flooding South Lebanon for that citation. And that shocked me, but what really shocked me into action, and so many people in my generation had this experience, was Operation Cast Lead. Just watching it. The day of that attack, I actually argued with a Palestinian friend of mine and said, well, Hamas shouldn't have been sending those rockets in. Then I realized Israel was the one who violated the ceasefire with Hamas initially. And then I turned on the Al Jazeera live stream and saw the 65 police cadets who had just been inaugurated as cops in Gaza City, laying on the ground, writhing in a pool of blood with organs splattered everywhere because they had been targeted by a precision Israeli missile. And that continued for day after day after day until I broke. And I said, I'm a pretty decent journalist and I'm, well known. I'm going to use what I have to expose this situation. And so it started from there. A few months later, I had the deal to write Goliath. So that's kind of the intro to my story. And then to your question, now I get this question a lot about comparisons between what the state of Israel is doing to Palestinians and what Nazi Germany did to Jews. And of course there are comparisons that can be drawn, because there are comparisons that can be drawn between what Nazi Germany did to Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and dissidents and what's happening to different oppressed and marginalized groups everywhere. And as Americans, we're raised in a certain way and educated in a certain way that we see Nazi Germany as the ultimate framework for looking at evil. And so that's why we have these questions. But there is something that's more direct, which is that Zionism grows, and this Israeli idea of a Herrenvolk democracy or an ethnocracy grows out of the kind of thinking that was popular in Europe. It's in Northern Europe and Western Europe in the late 19th century during the high colonial age. And in the United States at that time, eugenics was popular. The idea of racial betterment through better breeding. Up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, there was a center for racial betterment. It was a J.G. Kellogg, the guy who invented cornflakes, ran this center. So where did Hitler get his ideas from? Hitler got his ideas from Kellogg and these eugenicists, from Americans, including liberal Americans who just believed that we could end poverty through better breeding. So Hitler himself wasn't totally unique. He didn't come out of a vacuum. And Hitler also had intellectual influences like Houston Chamberlain, who was into racial science. And Chamberlain was corresponding for many years with Arthur Ruppin, who was also a German who helped found Tel Aviv, and I think who helped standardize the Hebrew language. And they had many discussions about racial science. So these ideas were also popular among the people who introduced Zionism to the Holy Land. It's not unique. It's not a uniquely evil project. What the problem is that those systems were either extinguished in South Africa through massive resistance, through an international boycott, even through a campaign of terrorism spearheaded by Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, including the bombing of civilian targets. It was extinguished in the United States by the completion of the genocide of Native Americans, which allowed the U.S. to move towards an immigrant society. We have to recognize that ethnic cleansing is often a component of liberal democracies. And it was sort of extinguished in Africa through mass resistance to colonialism. But in Israel, it's still ongoing, and it is being continued through very high-tech means. Now, Mercedes is supplying the Israeli government, but so on the one hand, I have drawn direct connections in my book. That race riot you saw, where right-wing vandals shattered the glass of non-Jewish Africans because they are the racial outclass who have been demonized because of who they are. I called that chapter the Night of Broken Glass, referring to Kristallnacht. And at the time of Kristallnacht, there was no clear plan for the extermination of Jews, only for their dispossession and possible expulsion. So I am drawing on the universal lessons of the Holocaust, which declare never again, not just to Jews, but to anyone. And I don't see why that should be controversial. And I think we should affirm that today. I guess I'll leave it there. There's more to say. And we have 2 questions here. Okay, I'll go backwards on these questions. Oded Yunon was a Likud advisor in the early 80s or late 70s. I think he was under the Menachem Begin government. And I don't know how that connects to the first part of your question, but he basically expressed what Israel has always attempted to do in its relationship with the Arab world, which is what the neoconservative historian Bernard Lewis calls Lebanonization. With Lebanon, Lebanon is a very sectarian country, and it has been at war with itself, even as it was, and through this civil war in Lebanon, which Israel participated in, it weakened itself and weakened its capacity to resist the Israeli treatment of Palestinians and so on. And so Yunus has proposed, supporting minority sects around the Arab world and promoting the fragmentation of Arab countries by promoting enmity and conflict between different sects and supporting them so that the Arab world is constantly in a state of instability, which leaves Israel in the state it's in. And we're witnessing that play out during the Arab Spring, although Israel isn't directly involved, in my opinion, and from what I can tell, in anything happening in Syria or what's happening anywhere else. It's simply sitting back and enjoying the show. With Syria in ruins, that's another Arab country that they've gotten out of the way. Of course, we have to also recognize the Assad regime has been a great backdoor ally of Israel and has not done anything to retrieve the Golan Heights, negotiated with Israel over that, crushed Palestinian resistance in Lebanon during the War of the Camps, and pretty much has always, and so Israel is in a situation where it would like to see the Assad regime stay in power, but weakened with less control over the country than it has. The last thing it wants is for some group like one of the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups to gain more strength, because they're such a wild card. There's no way to know what they can do. And that's their approach. Then their approach to the Arab world is destabilization. I can talk about specific things they've done, but I want to get to the next question, which is about, the idea.
Answer my other one about why not go back to.
Well, that's been done, and I really recommend. there's so much history on that, but I really recommend a new book, Genesis, by John Judas, which goes back and describes the history of the Balfour Declaration and the history of Israel's relationship with the colonial powers. Ben-Gurion early on recognized that Israel that this Jewish state couldn't come to bear and be preserved without a relationship with one of the four great powers at the time, Russia, England, France, or the U.S. Now all they have left is the U.S. as their kind of colonial patron. Israel has always marketed back to the U.S. tactics that the U.S. had previously used, which the U.S. has pioneered. So the last thing I want to do is give the impression that things that our police are doing or things that authoritarian regimes around the world are doing because Israel influenced them to do so. Israel gave themselves the means to do so because they have been able to use Palestinians for 65 years, a restive indigenous population, as kind of lab rats to develop and field test new methods of control and domination. But they're only giving that to people, to regimes and states and police departments who want it. So, we can look at what happened in the U.S. during the Cold War in the 1980s. There was a man named Efraim Rios Montt in Guatemala, who is known as the Saddam Hussein of Latin America. He slaughtered tens of thousands of Mayans in a campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And the U.S. didn't want to directly arm him. There was the Boland Amendment, which required an executive order or a presidential signature as evidence that the U.S. was funding one of these organizations or one of these governments, or authorizing the CIA to act and do something like assassination. So Israel filled the void. They went to Israel and said, can you arm Rios Montt against these communist rebels? And so the training came to Rios Montt, including advanced computer systems, more advanced than anywhere in the world, which allowed Rios Montt to round up tens of thousands of dissidents. It was an Israeli computer that Rios Montt kept the files on dissidents in, which allowed his men to round them up, take them away, and disappear them. It was Israeli Uzis that were held by Rios Montt's soldiers. Rios Montt said, the Israeli soldier is our model. And it was Israeli training that enabled him to carry out this genocide. And he is going to, I think he has been convicted of genocide. There's a great film called Granito, by the filmmaker who interviewed Rios Montt and gained the testimony which led to his conviction. And you can see the weaponry that they're using. Israel was at the same time arming and engaging in all kinds of trade with apartheid South Africa based on a shared concern about Arab nationalism and communism and shared values of racial nationalism. And those, the letters between Ariel Sharon and his counterpart in South Africa are reproduced in the book The Secret Alliance, which came out, I think, in 2010, and is about Israel's relationship with South Africa. And they traded technology on building walls, on confining their indigenous population. There's always been these shared values. The Cold War is over, and Israel needs to find a way of being valuable to these powerful countries who are its patrons. So one of the things they're doing through pro-Israel organizations in the US, like the ADL, but especially JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, is training cops. And I'm sure that if you look in Seattle, your police chief or major, yeah, so you can tell us all about it. Like hundreds of cops, thousands of cops have been trained in these Israeli counter-terror seminars, or they've been taken to Israel on trips where they view the separation wall and learn that the wall is helping them control terrorism. Small-town cops, I wrote about this in an article called The Israelification of Domestic Security. Small-town cops are being taught how to shoot suicide bombers. They're being told to aim for the head. U.S. cops are taken to the Ketziot prison in Israel on tour, and this is a prison where G4S supplies surveillance and monitoring systems. And then they come back here with the lessons they've learned and apply them. And I think these are dangerous lessons because they learn to view the civilian population as an endemic enemy and as potential terrorists. Avi Dichter, the former head of the Israeli Shin Bet, spoke at a meeting of FBI agents and said, we need to view crime in terms of crimi-terror, that criminals could be potential terrorists and terrorists are all criminals. Let's blur the line between the criminal and the terrorist. Now, the idea of the criminal is completely blurred in this country too, because of those migrants I met, those undocumented immigrants, how are they criminals? According to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department, DHS, crime means any contact they have with law enforcement, any contact. So this is just adding to the increasingly draconian environment we find ourselves in this country. The Mall of the Americas, which is the largest shopping mall in the US, is now using Israeli security methods. They hired a former leader of a dog unit in the Israeli army, Oketz, to design their security procedures, and people going through the Mall of Americas are being stopped and frisked and checked everywhere they go, especially people of color. One guy, a Pakistani vendor, left his cell phone on a table and found FBI agents at his door the next day. Logan Airport in Boston, there is a guy, I think his name is Mike Rosen, who is the director of security there, and they're facing lawsuit after lawsuit from African Americans who've been suddenly racially profiled at Logan using Israeli methods. So it's terrible to actually take these shared values and inaugurate them in our cities, in our towns, and in our public places. And we see what it leads to. And just a final point, which I think should apply to any action around BDS, is the recognition that this system for Israel is very sustainable. That for Palestinians, it's not. Palestine could be disappeared within our lifetimes. There is an Israeli plan to annex the West Bank. The Gaza Strip has been besieged under this very unusual project for almost 10 years, but for Israelis, it's a profitable model. Between Operation Cast Lead and the escalation on the Gaza Strip in November 2012, Israeli arms sales increased by over $1 billion. There's a film called The Lab, which is hard to get. It's made by an Israeli director who is a former writer for Haaretz. And it's all about the Israeli arms industry and how they market their arms as field tested. I think it's one of the best films about Israel and what it's become in the modern era. If you can find any way of watching it and showing it, it's highly recommended. Now we have these two questions, and if we can get to everyone, it would be great. I'll call on you last after the gentleman here. I'll try to avoid you as much as possible. Well, that was brought up by the J Streeter who stormed out. And J Street is kind of the liberal wing of the pro-Israel lobby, so I guess you can see where they're at right now in this time after the death of the peace process. But you know, I know a lot of people in J Street U who are good, well-meaning people as well, and they're looking for a solution. And hopefully they'll defect and start to organize for Palestinian equal rights. The book you mentioned, Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, is the first book to introduce to a mass audience the idea of Israel committing ethnic cleansing, which is kind of classified under international law as a crime. I did a talk with him a few months ago, and he explained how he fought his publishers to call his book to use that title because of the implications. And he has gone into the Haganah archives and the Zionist archives to provide a clinically detailed history of a coherent plan to produce an Israel as free of Palestinians as possible. Now, to the other question, what was the question again? The equal, balance. And well, both sides have used violence, and both sides are increasingly radicalized. But one side controls the other side completely. The only time in recent history that Palestinians controlled a single citizen of Israel was when Gilad Shalit was held captive. And they exchanged him for thousands of Palestinian prisoners, I think around 10,000, which shows the value of a Palestinian in the eyes of Israel. Israel controls every single Palestinian through one means or another, through an elaborate matrix of control between the river and the sea. And that's kind of what I've explained today. So we're not talking about good and evil. The Palestinians aren't the good guys and the Israelis are the evil guys. Although what Israelis might do, we classify as evil. But there are people on both sides that I like, and there are people on both sides that I don't like. And I will never accept being called pro-Palestinian. It's not a football game. I'm not like, yay, Palestine, let me wave the flag. If you're Palestinian, maybe you might feel that way, but I am looking at this in terms of justice and injustice. And one side is committing massive injustice towards the other, and it won't end until the playing field is equalized. That's where BDS comes in. BDS isn't a solution, it's a tactic for leveling the playing field by applying massive external pressure on Israel to convince it that this system of apartheid is not normal and it has to be abandoned. There will be a peace process. The current peace process is to consolidate the system of apartheid and to produce a system of permanent occupation accepted by the entire world, including the Arab world, to legitimize that system. With BDS, there is the possibility of a real peace process, which is based on the terms of negotiation that Nelson Mandela demanded. He said, I will never come to the table except to negotiate the end of the apartheid. And that's the only peace process that we should accept. Finally. Yeah, well, I've heard all of this. This is more vintage Zionist Hasbara or propaganda. Well, I'm going to address it, all right? You're very privileged to be able to stand up and talk as long as you want without having produced any work of any significance. And we've heard you 2 nights this week, and we let you talk all you wanted. And so I'm going to address you. I'm sure you can say a lot more. Now, you talked about various attacks on the Jewish settler colonial population in Mandate Palestine, which were violent attacks that occurred in the context of Arab resistance to Zionism, which also occurred.
Jewish community in Hebron.
Well, they are not. There was a Jewish community in Hebron that Haim Hanegbi was a part of. Haim Hanegbi has put these attacks in context, and his community was supplemented by a new community that was not indigenous to Hebron and began campaigning for a Jewish state and for the expulsion of Arabs. It was There's no justification for these attacks, but these attacks occurred in the same settler colonial context as the attacks on American settlers by Native Americans. Many Americans were killed in the American West after a series of attacks on Americans, including women and children who were slaughtered by Arapaho Sioux and Lakota Sioux in Colorado. We had the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre, when Colonel Shivington and his troops literally cut the babies out of pregnant women, slaughtered an entire village, and the scalps of those Indians were displayed at the Apollo Theater in Denver, Colorado in 1861. This is all documented in D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it's that same kind of settler colonial context and settler colonial project that produces this kind of antagonism and violence. So you're acting like the Jews are the victims in this situation. It's not the case. Now finally, I have to jump ahead, but what you've sought to do is something that many Jewish Israeli leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu have sought to do, which is to blame Palestinians for what Germans did to Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, and to hold Palestinians responsible for the killing of 6 million Jews in Europe, which is one of the most irresponsible acts possible and is not historically provable. Despite Haj Amin al-Husseini's relationship with Nazi leaders, he was not responsible for the killing of any Jews. It was the Germans who did it. And what you are seeking to do is make Palestinians complicit because of their resistance to this settler colonial project. What you are doing is abusing the memory, in my opinion, of the Jews who died fighting Nazism. Tens of thousands of Jews took up arms to fight against their occupier in Nazi-occupied Europe, and you're abusing their memory. They weren't fighting Palestinians. They were fighting Germans and their allies. What you are doing is hollowing out the lessons of the Holocaust. You're negating those lessons. What you are doing is almost the ethical equivalent of Holocaust denial. And we have to recognize that you are not unique in doing it. That at Bar-Ilan University, last year, in October, Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the entire faculty and the entire student body in a nationally televised major national security speech and said the same exact thing as you did, except in greater detail, blaming the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem for the slaughter of 4,000 Jewish children in World War II Europe and for the final solution.
It was his idea.
Well, this is only history that I've seen from Alan Dershowitz, and it's been completely discredited. I think that this was the idea of Nazis at the Wannsee Conference, and I condemn any act of Holocaust revisionism that abuses the memory of the Jews who were killed by Nazis, whether it's anti-Semites or Zionists who are doing it. We want to get one last question. You've had your hand up for a long time, and then we will wrap it up because you guys have lives unlike me.
I take you for a secularist, a modern secularist, so you may have overlooked, and I just wanted to ask you whether you've looked into the origins of racist Zionism in the Old Testament, particularly in the first 5 books, or the books 2 through 5, and in Ezra and Jeremiah.
Well, I see Zionism as a settler colonial project, not a essentially Jewish project, and I don't see Judaism or the Jewish religion or Jewish people as, culpable for what's happening to Palestinians. I think it's a narrow minority and a project that was unpopular among Jews at a certain point before World War II, before the Holocaust made the success of this project more possible, that is responsible. And so you want to look at the Old Testament. I think that's very problematic. The Old Testament is a racist, genocidal book. I mean, fine. But who is taking that book literally? Who is even capable of taking that book literally? I think there's some good lessons in there and some terrible lessons in there. I think, any religious document can be seen as incredibly dangerous. But people that I know who are practicing in the modern world tend to interpret certain things out. Like in Islam, you have an imam who will interpret certain things. Like Hassan Turabi has said, I think that it's even permissible for Muslim women to marry non-Muslim men, an opinion that's not widely accepted. But there are all these debates going on. You know, correct me if I'm wrong. There are debates in Judaism. You know, the Judaism that I grew up in, Reform Judaism, is like a shadow of Orthodox Judaism. So like when I got older, I would try to go to Orthodox shuls and try to, you know, do what they do. And it's like you just get the page number on a board. You don't have the rabbi telling you to rise like you're in a church. There's so many different strains of Judaism and ways of being Jewish. And you see that in Christianity too. That's why you have this conflict between Christian Zionists who are embracing an apocalyptic Christianity based on the book of Revelation, which was never even in the Bible, and you know the mainliners from the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church, people who've been hosting me, who hosted me at Seville. So to like essentialize a religion and hold it responsible for what's happening, I think is, I mean, it's wrong, but it's also problematic. Because it can lead to a kind of prejudiced viewpoint. Thank you, everybody.